"Can you take her instead of me?" asked the Apache boy. The rancher said nothing, then took both. The sun was sinking slowly behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The land stretched far and wide as if the earth itself was reaching out to touch the horizon. The desert wind blew softly, stirring the dust across the open plains. In the distance, a figure moved steadily toward a small rocky outcrop, his head bent low, and his steps sure and quiet. He was young, no older than 15, and though he looked like a boy, his eyes told a different story. They were filled with worry, with fear, and yet with a kind of resolve that only someone in desperate need could have. The boy, named Ahuli, was Apache. He had grown up on these lands, in the shadow of his people's traditions, with the weight of their struggles pressing heavily on his young shoulders. His people had always lived on the land, roaming freely, but now their way of life was under threat. The settlers, the ranchers, the soldiers, they were all part of the wave that was pushing his people into smaller and smaller corners. The Apache had fought back, of course, but in the face of the growing numbers of their enemies they were losing. Ahuli's family had already been forced to give up their home. The land they once roamed had been taken. His father, a proud warrior, had passed away after a long battle, leaving his mother and younger sister behind. The boy was the man of the family now, and it was a heavy burden. His mother had tried to keep them all together, but it was getting harder each day. They had been living in the wilderness, surviving on what little they could find. But the weather was changing, and the land was growing colder. Food was scarce, and the boy could see the worry in his mother's eyes. She was a strong woman, but even she could not carry the weight of this life alone. As Ahuli walked along the rocky outcrop, he thought of his mother. She was a beautiful woman, tall and proud, with dark hair that fell in waves down her back. Her skin was dark from years of living under the sun, her eyes warm and full of kindness, yet also burdened with the pain of their situation. The boy's heart ached for her. She had been a warrior in her own way, fighting to protect their family, but she was growing tired. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she moved, in the way she held herself now. The stress was eating away at her. And then there was his sister, the youngest of the family. She was still a child, innocent and pure, with bright eyes full of wonder and joy. She didn't understand the struggles they were facing. All she knew was that her world was growing smaller, and she didn't have the words to express the fear she must have felt. Ahuli had tried to shield her from it, but there was only so much he could do. Ahuli knew they couldn't survive much longer like this. Something had to change. His mind raced as he thought of the only option left, the only person who could help them now. The rancher. The rancher was a man of wealth and power. He owned much of the land surrounding their once prosperous village. Some said he was kind, while others said he was cruel. Ahuli didn't know what to think. He had heard stories of the rancher, of how he had helped others in need, but he also knew that many of those who went to him never returned. It was a gamble, one that Ahuli couldn't avoid. His mother had always told him not to trust the ranchers. They had taken so much already, but what choice did they have? The winter was coming and they were running out of time. They couldn't keep going on like this. The boy was tired of seeing his mother struggle, tired of seeing his sister's smile fade with each passing day. He couldn't let them starve. It was at that moment, standing alone in the fading light of the day, that Ahuli made his decision. He would go to the rancher. But he didn't want to go alone. He couldn't. He had to protect his mother. He had to do everything he could to save her. That's when it came to him, the only way he could do this. The boy's heart was pounding in his chest as he started walking toward the ranch. His feet felt heavy, like the earth itself was trying to pull him back. But he didn't stop. The long road stretched ahead of him, the path filled with uncertainty and fear, but also with a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was their chance. As he approached the ranch, the boy could see the large stone walls that surrounded it, the tall buildings where the ranchers lived and worked. There were horses grazing in the fields and the sound of cattle mooing in the distance. Everything about the ranch seemed so foreign to him, so different from the way his people lived. It was like entering another world, a world that was full of wealth and power, but also danger. Auli stopped at the edge of the ranch, looking out across the fields. He could see a man on horseback, riding slowly toward the barn, the rancher. Ahuli's stomach tightened. This was the moment. He had to do it now, or they would have no future. Taking a deep breath, the boy walked toward the man. His heart was racing, and his palms were sweating, but he had no choice. This was the only chance they had. When the rancher saw him coming, he stopped the horse and looked down at him, his face serious and unreadable. Ahuli stood there, struggling to find the right words. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Finally, after a long silence, he said, "Can you take her instead of me?" The rancher looked at him for a long moment. The boy could feel the weight of his gaze, as if the man were trying to read his very soul. But the rancher didn't answer right away. He just stared at Ahuli, his face hard, his expression unreadable. The boy's heart thudded in his chest. Was the rancher going to reject him? Was this going to be another failure? The thought almost made him collapse. But then, the rancher spoke. His voice was deep and calm, like the sound of wind through the trees. "I'll take both of you," he said. Ahuli froze. He hadn't expected that. He thought the rancher would take his mother, but not both of them. The boy's mind raced. Did this man mean what he said? Could he really be trusted? But the rancher's eyes didn't falter. There was something in them, something that told Ahuli that the man wasn't lying. The boy nodded, a flood of relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. His mother and sister would be safe. The rancher gave him a small, barely perceptible nod and turned his horse back toward the barn. "Come with me," he said, his voice low and firm. And so, Ahuli followed, his heart still pounding, but now with a sense of hope. They had a future now, a chance at survival, and for the first time in a long while, the boy allowed himself to believe that things might get better. Ahuli walked beside the rancher, the sound of their footsteps the only noise in the otherwise silent evening. The rancher's horse moved at a steady pace, the animal's hooves clopping against the dirt road, while Ahuli, his head held low, matched the rhythm, unsure of what would come next. They approached the ranch's large weathered wooden gates, which opened slowly as a man working in the barn noticed them. His eyes shifted between Ahuli and the rancher, but he didn't speak. He simply stepped aside and let them pass. The ranch was much larger than Ahuli had expected. It stretched as far as the eye could see, with fields and pastures spread out over the land like an endless sea. There were barns and outbuildings dotting the horizon, each one full of life and activity. Horses galloped freely in the pastures, cattle grazed lazily under the shade of nearby trees, and workers moved briskly between the structures, tending to the livestock. The air was filled with the sounds of a busy, thriving place, and Ahuli felt a sense of awe. This was a world he knew very little about. As they walked toward the main house, Ahuli couldn't help but notice the contrast between the ranch and his own people's way of life. His people had always been nomadic, moving from place to place, living off the land. But here, everything seemed so fixed, so permanent. The rancher had a life of stability and order, and Ahuli found himself wondering how such a life could be lived. The man had everything, it seemed, while his people had nothing. It was hard to reconcile the two worlds. The rancher led him up a wide, covered porch that wrapped around the front of the house. The door opened silently as they approached, revealing a spacious interior. The floors were made of polished wood, and the air inside smelled of fresh pine and leather. It was a far cry from the crude shelters Ahuli had grown accustomed to in the wilderness. He had never seen such luxury, and he felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. It wasn't that he was ungrateful. It was just that everything here felt so strange to him, so different from what he knew. "Sit," the rancher said, motioning toward a large wooden chair by the fireplace. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the room's stone walls. Ahuli hesitated for a moment, then sat down, his hands resting awkwardly in his lap. He couldn't help but feel out of place. He wasn't used to sitting in chairs like this. His people had always sat on the ground around a fire, with their families close by. The rancher moved to the large hearth where a kettle was simmering. He poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Ahuli. The boy took it carefully, unsure of what to do with it at first. The warm steam rose from the cup, and for a moment Ahuli closed his eyes, savoring the heat that reached his hands. It was the first time in a long while that he had felt something comforting. "Thank you," Ahuli murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He had never expected the rancher to offer such kindness, not after everything his people had been through. He had imagined that the rancher would take them in only to use them, to make them work for what little they could get. But this rancher was different. "I didn't do this for you," the rancher said suddenly, breaking the silence. Ahuli looked up startled. The rancher's gaze was steady, his expression serious. "I did it for her," he added, his voice softer now. Ahuli blinked, not understanding. "For your mother," the rancher clarified. Ahuli felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't expected the rancher to care for his mother in such a way. The boy had feared that they were nothing more than a charity case, a burden for the rancher to bear. But now, hearing the rancher's words, he realized that the man saw something more. He wasn't just offering them shelter out of pity. He was offering it out of something deeper, something unspoken. The rancher sat down across from Ahuli, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "I'm not a fool, boy," he said, the edge of his voice returning. "I know why you came to me, and I'm not going to pretend I did it out of kindness alone. But that doesn't mean I won't honor my word." Ahuli nodded quickly, understanding the unspoken terms. He had come to the rancher for a deal. He had asked for a place for his mother, and in return, they would work the land. It wasn't charity, but it was something more. The rancher was a businessman, and Ahuli had expected nothing less. "Tomorrow, you'll start helping with the livestock," the rancher continued. "You'll work with the other boys. Your mother will help in the house. It's simple enough work. You'll earn your keep." Ahuli didn't mind the work. He had always been strong, had always worked with his hands. It was the way of his people. They were never afraid of hard labor. But there was something in the rancher's tone that made Ahuli uneasy. The rancher's words weren't cruel, but there was a sense of ownership in them, a subtle reminder that they weren't free. Whereas, it was a constant reminder of their position here, as guests on someone else's land. The evening wore on in silence as the rancher and Ahuli sat together by the fire. The boy's thoughts raced as he sipped the tea, trying to make sense of this strange turn his life had taken. A few hours ago he had been standing in the dust, uncertain of his future, and now he was sitting in a grand house with the man who had offered them refuge. The contrast was overwhelming, but it was also a relief. His mother would be safe. She would no longer have to worry about where the next meal would come from, and his sister would have a future. But Ahuli couldn't help but wonder how long this peace would last. Would the rancher truly keep his word? Would he see them as more than just workers on his land? And would they ever truly belong here, in this strange new world, so far from everything they had ever known? The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the room. Ahuli felt the weight of exhaustion settling in his bones, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The rancher had promised them safety, but Ahuli knew that safety often came at a price. And sometimes, that price was higher than anyone could imagine. As the night deepened, Ahuli stood, unable to sit still any longer. He walked to the window and looked out over the sprawling ranch. The night was still, the stars above bright and endless. Somewhere far off in the distance, the howl of a wolf echoed through the mountains. Ahuli listened for a moment, his thoughts a whirlwind. His people had always lived by the land, had always trusted in their instincts and the rhythm of nature. But now he was part of something else, something he didn't fully understand. Turning away from the window, Ahuli made his way back to the fire. He still had many questions, but for now, he could only wait. Wait to see what the rancher's word truly meant and what would come next. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Ahuli felt a flicker of hope. Tomorrow, the work would begin. And perhaps, just perhaps, tomorrow would be the start of something new. The next morning the sun had barely risen when Ahuli found himself standing in front of the barn, a fresh chill in the air. The ranch was waking up slowly, the sounds of horses whinnying and the distant clank of tools filling the morning silence. Ahuli rubbed his eyes, still weary from the long journey, but he knew that today would mark the beginning of a new chapter for him and his family. The rancher had promised them safety, and now it was time to fulfill their part of the bargain. The rancher had not spoken much that night, but his words had been clear. They were now part of the ranch, and it was time for them to work. The boy was not afraid of work, though. He had grown up learning the ways of the land, following his father's footsteps as they hunted and gathered what they needed. Work was part of life, something that built strength and character. But the ranch was different, and Ahuli felt it in the air. This was not his world. Still, he stood tall and ready. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it as he always had, with determination and resolve. As he approached the barn, the smell of hay and livestock filled his nostrils. The barn was large, made of thick timber and stone. It was sturdy, practical, with a few stalls for the horses and cattle. The sun cast long shadows across the dirt floor as he stepped inside, and the warmth of the animals created a comforting contrast to the cool morning air. He could hear the soft snorts and movements of the horses, the low moo of cattle, and the occasional sound of hooves on the ground. A man in his 30s was already there, working with one of the horses. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent under the harsh sun. His hands were rough, skilled, and he worked with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime handling animals. He glanced up when he noticed Ahuli enter, his expression neutral. "You must be the boy," the man said gruffly, his voice deep and commanding. Ahuli nodded, unsure of what to say. He had expected to meet someone who would train him, show him the ropes, but the man before him seemed to expect nothing more than to be left alone with his work. The man continued, "I'm Eli. I'll show you what needs to be done today. We've got work to do." Ahuli followed Eli without a word, his eyes scanning the barn. There were several horses in the stalls, their coats gleaming in the soft light. The animals seemed well cared for, their eyes calm and intelligent. He had seen horses before, of course, but he had never been around them so closely. His people had their own horses, used for hunting and traveling, but nothing like these. These were strong, sturdy animals, and they looked like they were bred for hard work. Eli led him to one of the stalls, where a large brown horse stood. Its ears flicked back and forth, and it stamped its hooves in agitation. Eli spoke to Ahuli in a low tone. "This is Thunder. He's a good horse, but he's a bit difficult to handle. You're going to brush him down, then saddle him up. He's got a lot of energy, so you'll need to be careful." Ahuli didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, reaching out his hand to Thunder. The horse snorted but didn't back away. Ahuli had always known how to approach animals. It was something his father had taught him from an early age. The key was to show respect, not fear. Slowly he ran his hand down Thunder's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's skin beneath the coarse hair. The horse seemed to relax under his touch, its muscles softening as Ahuli continued to calm it. He worked silently, brushing down Thunder's coat, paying careful attention to every part of the horse's body. As he worked, he felt a strange sense of peace. Despite the differences between this life and the one he had known, there was something familiar about the quiet rhythm of caring for the animal. It reminded him of his childhood, of simpler times when the world was less complicated. Once Thunder was brushed down, Ahuli moved to saddle the horse. He had done this before, but the saddle was different from the one he was used to. It was larger, heavier, and more intricate. Eli watched closely, his arms crossed, his face impassive. Ahuli's hand shook slightly as he struggled to lift the saddle onto Thunder's back. It took him longer than he wanted, but finally the saddle was in place. "Not bad," Eli said, nodding slightly. "You've got the basics down. We'll see how you handle the rest of it." Ahuli mounted the horse, feeling the weight of the saddle shift under him. The horse was strong and sturdy, but it wasn't as easy to control as the wild horses he had ridden in his youth. Thunder had been trained for work, and it showed in the way the animal responded to every movement. "Take him out to the field," Eli instructed. Let him run a little. We need to see if you can control him." Ahuli nodded and nudged Thunder forward. The horse trotted steadily, its hooves clicking against the dirt floor of the barn as they moved toward the open door. Ahuli felt the wind against his face as they stepped outside, the land stretching out before him. This was where the rancher's life was made, out here, in the fields and pastures. Once they were clear of the barn, Ahuli urged Thunder into a canter. The horse surged forward, its muscles rippling with power. Ahuli felt the familiar thrill of riding, the rush of wind in his hair. For a moment he allowed himself to relax, to forget about the pressures of the ranch, about the past. He was free for a few moments, riding alongside the sun as it climbed higher in the sky. But it wasn't long before Thunder's energy started to show. The horse became restless, its hooves pounding faster and faster. Ahuli had to pull back on the reins to slow him down, but the horse was determined to run. It took all of Ahuli's strength to keep control, to keep the horse from galloping out of control. His heart raced as he fought to maintain control, his body instinctively following the movements of the horse. He had been on wild horses before, but this was different. Thunder was trained, and yet it was still unpredictable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ahuli managed to bring Thunder to a stop. The horse was panting, its sides heaving with exertion. Ahuli sat still, his breath coming fast as he tried to steady himself. He had done it. He had managed to control the horse. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. There was much more to learn, and the rancher's world was one of constant challenges. He returned to the barn, guiding Thunder back into the stable. Eli was waiting for him, watching him closely as he dismounted. The rancher didn't speak right away, but his eyes held something that Ahuli couldn't quite decipher. Approval? Disappointment? He wasn't sure, but he could feel the weight of the man's gaze on him.
"You did well," Eli said finally, his voice low but genuine.
"Not many boys can control Thunder like that. You've got the skills. Just remember, this is work, not a game. Keep your focus, and you'll do fine." Ahuli nodded, his chest swelling with pride. He had done well, but he knew that the ranch was a far cry from what he was used to. This was a different world, a world where hard work and strength were valued above all else. But even so, he was determined to make it work. For his mother, for his sister, and for himself. As the day wore on, Ahuli continued to work alongside the other men, learning the ways of the ranch. He helped with the cattle, moved bales of hay, and fed the horses. He worked until his muscles ached and his hands were sore, but he didn't mind. The work was hard, but it felt honest. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was earning his place. The sun began to set, casting the ranch in a warm golden light. Ahuli stood by the barn, looking out over the fields. His body was tired, but his mind was clear. This was the beginning of a new life, a life full of challenges, but also full of hope. The ranch had given them a chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. The days passed quickly on the ranch, each one blending into the next. The work was hard, but Ahuli didn't mind. There was a rhythm to it, a way the ranch moved like the steady beat of a drum. Every morning he would wake before dawn, the air cool and crisp, and he would set to work. The horses needed to be fed, the cattle needed to be tended to, and the fields needed constant care. It was a life of constant motion, but for the first time in a long while, Ahuli felt a sense of purpose. His mother had settled into a routine of her own, helping around the house, cooking meals, and even offering to teach the rancher's wife how to prepare some of the traditional foods from their homeland. She seemed to be finding her place in the house, though there was always a distant look in her eyes. Ahuli knew she missed the old ways, the old life. But she was adjusting, just as he was. Still, the weight of their situation had not gone away. The ranch was a world full of people who had always lived in it, a world that didn't understand the struggles of someone like Ahuli. It wasn't easy for him to fit in. He wasn't like the other boys who had grown up with ranching and livestock. He had been born a nomad, a child of the wilderness, and he carried that with him everywhere he went. The other ranch hands were polite enough, but there was a distance between them. Ahuli was still an outsider, someone who didn't belong. He could see the way they looked at him, the way they whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. He was an Apache boy, a boy who had once been part of a world that they didn't understand. The ranchers and the settlers didn't trust people like him, that much was clear. One afternoon, as Ahuli was working in the fields, he heard voices approaching. He looked up to see a group of men coming over the hill, riding on horseback. They were strangers, their clothes dusty and worn from travel. One of them was the rancher's cousin, a tall man named Jeb who worked on a neighboring ranch. He was a burly man, broad in the chest with a scar running down his cheek. As they approached, Ahuli straightened and wiped the sweat from his brow. The men dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with heavy thuds. Jeb approached the boy, his gaze cold. "Ahuli," he said, his voice gruff. "We need you to help move some cattle. We've got a herd that needs to be rounded up." Ahuli nodded silently, ready to do his part. It was the kind of work he was used to. He had grown up herding cattle and horses, although he had never done it in such a large and controlled environment. The ranchers didn't work the way his people did. It was different here. The other men, all seasoned ranch hands, mounted their horses and rode out to the field where the cattle grazed. Ahuli followed them, feeling the familiar rush of energy that came with the work. The ranch was far from home, but herding cattle was something that had been passed down in his family, something that had been a part of him for as long as he could remember. It was a skill that would help him fit in, or at least that's what he told himself. The herd was large, the cattle spread out across the wide open field. Ahuli and the men rode out, their horses moving swiftly through the tall grass, their eyes scanning the herd for any signs of trouble. It didn't take long for Ahuli to find himself in the thick of it, guiding the cattle with firm commands, his horse responding easily to his directions. But there was something different about this herd. The cattle were skittish, more jumpy than he had expected. The horses snorted and pranced nervously, and Ahuli felt a shift in the air. Something wasn't right. The first sign came when one of the cows broke from the group, charging toward the edge of the field. The ranch hands shouted, urging their horses to move faster, but the cow was quick, darting through the field like a streak of lightning. Ahuli's heart pounded in his chest as he spurred his horse forward, racing to cut the cow off before he could escape. But the cow was fast, and it seemed to know exactly where it wanted to go. Ahuli's horse followed it, the wind whipping through his hair as they galloped across the field. The other men were behind him, shouting orders and urging their horses forward. But Ahuli was in the lead now, focused on nothing but the cow and the narrow path ahead. The cow veered left, then right, dodging the other horses. Ahuli's horse followed its every move, cutting off its escape route, but the cow was relentless. It was a game of cat and mouse, one that Ahuli had played countless times before. He was close now, the cow's hooves pounding the earth in a rhythmic beat, the sound echoing in his ears. He urged his horse forward, trying to get ahead of the cow before it could turn again. The animal was wild, frantic, and Ahuli's heart raced with adrenaline. This was the moment, the one chance to get the herd back on track. With one final surge, Ahuli leaned forward, guiding his horse with a swift turn. His hand clutched the reins tightly, his body moving in perfect sync with the animal. The cow turned, and for a moment it seemed like it would break free. But Ahuli was ready. He shifted his weight, his horse responding instantly, and the cow was forced to stop. In that moment everything seemed to slow down. The cow's wild eyes met his, and for a heartbeat there was a connection, an understanding between animal and rider. The cow gave a reluctant snort and began to move back toward the herd. Ahuli guided it carefully, keeping pace until the rest of the ranch hands caught up. When the herd was finally gathered and the cattle had been safely moved, the men dismounted, their faces covered in sweat, their bodies tired from the hard work. Jeb came over to Ahuli, a look of surprise on his face.
"Well, I'll be damned," Jeb muttered. "You actually know what you're doing."
Ahuli nodded, his chest heaving with the effort. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The work had spoken for itself. The other men looked at him differently now, a new respect in their eyes. Ahuli had proven himself, not with words, but with action. But even as the men congratulated him on a job well done, Ahuli knew this wasn't enough. This wasn't the kind of acceptance he was looking for. They still didn't fully trust him. Not yet. But he could see it in their eyes now. There was a shift, a change in the way they looked at him. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to belong here. That evening, after the work was done, Ahuli sat by the fire, his body sore from the day's labor. His mother had already prepared a meal, the familiar smell of roasting meat and wild herbs filling the air. Ahuli felt a sense of peace as he ate, his mother's soft voice in the background, speaking of the days when they had lived in the mountains, before everything had changed. But despite the warmth of the fire, despite the food, a part of Ahuli couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change again. There were whispers around the ranch, rumors of trouble brewing in the town. Ahuli didn't know what it meant, but he could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the ranch hands anymore. It was something bigger, something that could threaten the fragile peace he had fought so hard to find. As he stared into the flames, Ahuli knew that his journey was far from over. The ranch had given him a chance, but it had also put him in the middle of a world that was far from simple. The challenges were just beginning, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Ahuli felt ready to face whatever came his way. The ranch had taken him in, and now it was up to him to prove that he belonged there. The days grew longer as summer settled over the ranch, the sun beating down on the fields in relentless waves. The work was grueling, but Ahuli had grown used to it. He woke early each morning, the air still cool before the heat of the day set in, and worked long into the night. Every moment of the day was filled with tasks, feeding the animals, cleaning the stalls, repairing fences, and making sure the crops were tended to. His muscles ached from the hard labor, but he pushed through, determined to prove himself. The rancher had kept his word, providing a roof over their heads, food to eat, and work for Ahuli and his mother. Life on the ranch had become their new reality, and for the most part, Ahuli had learned to accept it. But there were moments when he couldn't help but feel the weight of being an outsider. He wasn't like the other ranch hands who had grown up in this world. He wasn't like the settlers who had claimed the land as their own. He was Apache, and no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he proved himself, there were still those who would never fully accept him. One afternoon, as Ahuli was finishing up his work in the fields, he heard a commotion coming from the main house. His heart skipped a beat as he saw a group of men on horseback, riding toward the ranch. The sight of them immediately filled him with unease. They weren't familiar faces. They were strangers, and their presence on the ranch could only mean one thing: trouble. Ahuli stopped what he was doing and watched as the men dismounted. The leader of the group was a tall, imposing figure with a hard, weathered face. His eyes were dark and narrow, and he carried himself with an air of authority. The other men with him were similarly tough-looking, their faces set in grim expressions. Ahuli didn't need to hear their conversation to know that something was wrong. The rancher appeared from the house, his gaze steady as he approached the group of men. He wasn't smiling, but there was no fear in his eyes. He stood tall, a figure of strength and authority, and for a moment Ahuli thought that he might not even recognize the danger. The man in charge of the group spoke first. "I heard you've been sheltering an Apache boy here," he said, his voice low and cold. "I don't like that. We don't want his kind on our land." The rancher didn't flinch. "Ahuli has worked for me, and he's earned his place here," he said firmly. The stranger's lips curled into a sneer. "He's nothing but a savage. You're making a mistake, helping him." Ahuli stood in the background, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard the whispers, the rumors. He had known that it was only a matter of time before someone would challenge the rancher's decision to take him in. He had hoped that it wouldn't come to this, but now the tension was thick in the air, and he could feel the danger building. The rancher's eyes didn't leave the stranger's face. "Ahuli works hard. He's proven his worth, and he's part of this land now," the rancher said, his voice unwavering. "You'd do well to remember that." The stranger's expression darkened, and he stepped closer to the rancher. "You're making a mistake, and you'll regret it. We don't need your kind here." Ahuli's blood ran cold. The words the man spoke were a direct threat, and he knew that this could escalate quickly. He had seen enough in his life to understand when someone was about to make a dangerous move. Just as Ahuli took a step forward, ready to defend the rancher, something unexpected happened. The rancher turned to Ahuli, his eyes meeting the boy's for a brief moment. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had formed over the months of working side by side. The rancher didn't speak, but his gesture was clear. He was ready to stand his ground. Ahuli looked back at the strangers, his heart still pounding in his chest. He was terrified, but he wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let anyone threaten the safety they had worked so hard for. The rancher slowly stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're welcome to leave now. No one will be leaving this place until they've earned their place here, just like everyone else," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The stranger's eyes flickered with anger, but he didn't make a move. He knew that provoking the rancher further would only make things worse for him. With a tight-lipped smile, he finally spoke. "You'll regret this, old man. I'll make sure of it." Without another word, the group of men turned and mounted their horses. They rode off, disappearing into the distance. The air was still thick with tension, but the danger had passed for now. Ahuli let out a long breath, his body still tense. He had never felt so on edge, so vulnerable. He had been on the run before, had faced danger and loss, but this was different. This was his home now, and the rancher had made it clear that they weren't going to let anyone threaten it. The rancher stood for a moment, watching the men disappear. Then he turned to Ahuli. "You're part of this family now," he said quietly. "Don't forget that." Ahuli nodded, his throat tight. He hadn't realized how much those words would mean to him until he heard them. He had never felt truly accepted, not even by his own people, after they had been forced from their lands. But here, in this strange and unfamiliar place, the rancher was offering him something different, something real. That night, after the work was done and the sun had set, Ahuli sat by the fire with his mother. She had been quiet for most of the evening, her eyes distant as she prepared their meal. But when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been in a long time. "They came for you, didn't they?" she asked, her eyes meeting his.
Ahuli nodded.
"Yes." But the rancher, he stood up for me. His mother's face softened, and for the first time in a long time, a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "He's a good man, then." Ahuli didn't know how to respond. He had never been good at expressing his feelings, but his mother's words struck something deep inside him. The rancher had shown him more kindness than he ever thought possible. He had taken them in, protected them, and even risked his own safety to defend him. As they ate, the night settled into a peaceful quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of the night animals. Ahuli stared into the flames, his mind racing with everything that had happened. There were still challenges ahead, still uncertainties, but for the first time since they had arrived, he felt a sense of belonging, a sense that they were truly home. The next morning, as the sun rose, Ahuli woke early and went out to the fields. The work was waiting for him, but today it felt different. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was part of this place, part of something bigger than himself.
And that thought filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. The ranch had given him a chance to build something, to start over.
It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't always be simple, but it was theirs. It was home. As he worked, he could hear the sound of horses in the distance, the ranch hands calling out to one another and the cattle moving through the fields. The ranch was alive, just like the land. And Ahuli was part of it now. The ranch had become more than just a place to survive. It had become a place to live, to grow, and to find peace.